Hi, you are about to see one of the most famous landmarks in New York City right from your home. When the Brooklyn Bridge was finished in 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge in the entire world, and it was considered the engineering achievement of the era. And today, I'm going to take you on a 30-minute walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. I'm Katherine with Free Tours by Foot. Free Tours by Foot is a walking tour company that offers pay-what-you-wish walking tours in cities all over the world. In addition to those tours, we also offer self-guided tours, audio tours, and now virtual tours. We're going to be starting our walk across the Brooklyn Bridge today on the Brooklyn side of the bridge, but you can very easily start on the Manhattan side as well. To start from the Brooklyn side, there are a lot of subway options. You can take a subway to either Brooklyn Heights or Dumbo, the two closest neighborhoods, or you can hop a ride on the East River Ferry, which docks right behind me. Let's go ahead and get started. Now that we're up here on the Brooklyn Bridge, as we start walking, I just want to give you a little bit more background, some history, so that you know why this bridge was so necessary. They started construction on the Brooklyn Bridge in 1869, and it was desperately needed by that point. New York and Brooklyn were actually separate cities at this point. They didn't become one city until 1898. But they were both big, bustling cities. New York was the largest city in the United States. The Brooklyn Bridge was the fourth largest city in the United States. And even though they were separate cities, there was a lot of back and forth. A very large percentage of Brooklyn's workforce actually came into New York City every single day to go to work. With no Brooklyn Bridge, the only option commuters had was taking ferry boat service across the East River, which was definitely better than nothing. But the ferry boats could be inconsistent, especially if the weather was bad. If there was rain, snow, fog, there would be massive delays in ferry service. They were, by the mid-1800s, running 1,000 ferries across the East River every single day to accommodate the number of commuters. So a better solution was definitely needed. They wanted a bridge across the East River, but that was easier said than done at that point. The East River was the center for all maritime activity in New York and Brooklyn. So whatever they were building needed to be high enough for ships to pass underneath. And the span was also really long. This was actually 50% longer than the longest existing suspension bridge in the entire world. So whoever they chose to design this needed to really know what they were doing. They ended up hiring John Augustus Roebling, who was a German-born engineer. He had become known at this point in his career for his work on suspension bridges. Actually, the previous title holder of longest suspension bridge in the world, which was a bridge between Cincinnati, Ohio and Covington, Kentucky, had been designed by John Augustus Roebling. If you ever make it to go see that bridge, you will see a lot of similarities between that one and the Brooklyn Bridge. So the part of the bridge we're walking over right now is part of what's called the anchor. There's an anchor on both sides, Brooklyn and Manhattan. And this is where the massive suspension cables of the Brooklyn Bridge are anchored into place on both shores. So these are very, very large structures. The cables are pinned into place using about 60,000 tons of granite. And so they also decided, while they served a practical purpose for the Brooklyn Bridge, the Roeblings thought maybe there was an opportunity for a little money to be made. And in the Brooklyn anchor, inside the anchor, they designed 8 large rooms. They had vaulted cathedral-like ceilings, and they envisioned a shopping arcade being opened up there. The idea was the construction costs for the Brooklyn Bridge were running pretty high, and they were looking for a way for the bridge to start making a little income before it was ever even opened. They actually ended up using these anchorage spaces for a multitude of things over the years. It was municipal storage, there have been art exhibitions going on in there, but they were in public use until 2001, when unfortunately they were closed for security concerns. So right back this way, you can start to see the cables coming up above the bridge deck. So those four main suspension cables are the two running down the middle and then one down the right and the left. They are absolutely massive. It's a little hard to tell from this distance. And it looks like one solid cable. It is not. Each one of those main suspension cables is 5,000 individual strands wound together inside the cable. And those are attached down to the deck with 1,000 smaller cables. If you took every single wire on the Brooklyn Bridge and laid them out end to end, we could go from here to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, come back, and then make the entire trip over again. So a lot of steel wire went into making this bridge. So at the time, there were a couple different processes for manufacturing steel wire. One was inexpensive, but produced wire that wasn't quite as strong. One cost more, but the wire was considered far superior. So of course they wanted the really good, really strong wire here for the Brooklyn Bridge. The wire that was being delivered as it was being inspected, Washington Roebling, the chief engineer, discovered that some of the time they weren't getting the really good high quality wire that they had ordered. But because of the way this bridge was being constructed, all of these faulty wires were wound and bound up with the good wires, so there was no taking them off. The solution, any place they knew they had a bad strand, they put 150 good ones on top of it. But because of that, this bridge didn't actually make it to the benchmark of being 6 times stronger than it needed to be, which was the original goal. It's 4 times stronger than it needs to be, so we're still pretty good. But there was some concern early on about whether or not this bridge was really strong enough to hold all these people. To help assuage those fears, P.T. Barnum paraded 21 elephants across the Brooklyn Bridge in 1884, proving to New Yorkers that they were safe. Coming up, we have the Brooklyn Tower. There's a Brooklyn Tower and there's a Manhattan Tower. Both are made of granite, and the dramatic arched openings at the top are actually meant to be reminiscent of the windows in a Gothic cathedral. That was the inspiration for the design. So the height of this tower from the water is 276 feet, or about 84 meters. And I know that doesn't exactly sound staggering by today's standards, but something to bear in mind is when these were finished, the tallest structure in New York City was the spire of Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan, and this was only a couple of meters shorter than that. So this was one of the tallest things people in this city had seen. So these structures are made out of granite, and that meant they were going to be very large and very heavy, and they needed a really good solid foundation. So in order to lay the foundations to build these, they were going to have to get down to the bedrock underneath the riverbed in the East River, and that definitely presented a challenge because the bedrock was going to be about 44 feet down, or about 13.5 meters underneath the riverbed in the East River. So in order to excavate out the sand and the sediment and reach the bedrock, they were going to use something called caissons. If you're not familiar with caissons, the best way I can describe it is picture a big wooden box that is open on the bottom side. These were very, very large though. These were about the size of 4 tennis courts put together. And the way these functioned, very simply, was similar to if you've ever held a bucket upside down in water. As long as you continuously apply pressure, you can keep the water out. And that's what they were doing with the caissons, was keeping these pinned down into place using big blocks of granite. They'd fill the chamber with pressurized air, and workers would go in and start digging out the sand and the sediment and go down and down and down until they hit bedrock.
So if you're enjoying the tour so far, why don't you go ahead and click that like button, help others discover this video. And if you would like to watch more walking tour videos like this one, then also consider subscribing to our channel. In addition to New York, we offer tours in Washington, New Orleans, Boston, San Francisco, London, Berlin, and many more cities. And if you have any place that you'd like to see us offer a video tour of, then leave your suggestions in the comment section below. Now back to the tour.
So here on a plaque on the Brooklyn Tower, you actually have the names of 3 Roeblings. Emily Warren Roebling, Washington A. Roebling, and John A. Roebling. I'm going to tell you about all of them, but we're going to start here with John. I actually already mentioned him earlier. He was the person chosen to design this great bridge. And even though this is absolutely considered, I think, the crowning achievement of his career, he didn't live to see the bridge completed. In fact, he really didn't even see the start of real construction. Unfortunately, he was killed in an accident in 1869 when he was out surveying for the Brooklyn Bridge. His foot was crushed against a pier by an incoming ferry. He ended up having to have his toes amputated, and he died of a tetanus infection 3 weeks later. So his son, Washington Roebling, took over as the next chief engineer. He had worked alongside his father for a lot of his previous projects. We talked just a minute ago about the caissons and how they were working to excavate the riverbed. It ended up presenting a pretty big problem for the workers and the chief engineer here on the Brooklyn Bridge because these chambers were pressurized. And of course, we know today that the human body needs time to adjust from a pressurized air environment. That wasn't really known in the 1860s. What they did know is that the workers coming in and out of these caissons were getting very sick. You had a lot of people with dizziness, joint stiffness, swelling, blurred visions, and in some cases this was even fatal. Today we would call this decompression sickness or the bends. Back then it was called caissons disease. Of all of the people working on the Brooklyn Bridge, about 100 of them had some form of caissons disease, including Washington Roebling. And actually, because of caissons disease, he ended up bedridden pretty shortly into the Brooklyn Bridge project. He was bedridden all the way until the Brooklyn Bridge opened. So because he was bedridden in Brooklyn Heights, he was unable to be here on site every day to supervise the work and manage the project. So his wife Emily stepped in. Emily Warren Roebling had no formal training as an engineer. She was entirely self-taught, but she had developed an interest. Actually, she and Washington, as young newlyweds, spent their honeymoon in Europe, studying the use of caissons in bridge building. So very romantic. So Emily took over here and really took on all of the day-to-day duties that a chief engineer would normally do on-site. The on-site supervision, the giving orders, meeting with various contractors and city officials. Washington was watching with binoculars from their home in Brooklyn Heights. It was the two of them working this way hand in hand that actually got the Brooklyn Bridge finished in 1883. Emily Warren Roebling was the first person to cross the Brooklyn Bridge in a carriage. She did so holding a live rooster on her lap as a symbol of victory. Standing right smack in the middle of the Brooklyn Bridge. This is my favorite spot on the bridge because all of the cables are underneath the pedestrian deck and you have this really fantastic unobstructed 360-degree view of New York City. So behind me you can see out into the harbor. You can actually see the Statue of Liberty out there on Liberty Island, and then directly behind me is Governor's Island. As you look back towards Manhattan, you get a really beautiful view of Lower Manhattan. You can see some of the skyscrapers, including One World Trade, the new World Trade Center tower. And you can also see down to the South Street Seaport, there along the water's edge in Lower Manhattan. As you start looking back up towards Midtown, you can actually even see the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building from here. We have two more bridges that span the East River right along this stretch. The closest one is the Manhattan Bridge, and then the one a little further in the distance is the Williamsburg Bridge. The order of those bridges being completed: Brooklyn Bridge, 1883, then the Williamsburg Bridge in 1903, and then the Manhattan Bridge in 1912. Manhattan Bridge is actually quite close to the Brooklyn Bridge. That was on purpose. It was meant to be splitting the traffic from the Brooklyn Bridge so that there'd be a little less weight and a little less strain on this bridge. Both the Manhattan Bridge and the Williamsburg Bridge are longer than the Brooklyn Bridge. So this was not the title holder for longest suspension bridge in the world for all that long. up on the Manhattan Tower. Like I had said earlier, there's a Brooklyn Tower, there's a Manhattan Tower. Now, when they were excavating in the caissons, they ran into a little bit of a problem. We had mentioned the depth of the caisson there on the Brooklyn side. What they hadn't realized initially is that the riverbed was actually slanted. They wouldn't hit bedrock here on the Manhattan side till about 78 feet down, or about 24 meters. Rather than digging all that way down, they did a test of just the aggregate on top of the bedrock and said, it was good enough. So actually the caisson here on the Manhattan side is not on bedrock, the Brooklyn side is. I do want to go back to talking about these suspension cables again for just a minute, because I think knowing a little bit about how they were put together makes them all the more impressive. So these are really large cables. We talked about how large and how heavy they are. In the time, it made no sense for these cables to be created in their entirety off-site and then try to haul them into place here. The way they did them was one wire at a time here on site. They would use a traveler rope to take a wire from anchor to anchor. And that is no small feat if you consider that there are 331 wires per strand, 19 strands per cable. So this was a massive amount of work. It actually took a year and a half for this to complete this process. And actually, the tedium of pulling those wires across was only one part of the equation. Then you had to find workers that were going to travel along these wires, spinning them together. It wasn't a job that many people wanted. I think it seemed really dangerous and really scary. They ended up hiring sailors who were used to working around water and in the rigging on ships to complete these cables, spinning them together high above the water of the East River. So now we're walking out over the Manhattan anchor. Like I said earlier, there's a Brooklyn anchor, there's a Manhattan anchor. And while the Brooklyn anchor was designed for this shopping arcade, they had a little something different in mind for the Manhattan anchor. So they had to displace a lot of businesses here along the shoreline in order to clear the way to build the anchor. One of the businesses that was displaced was a wine distribution merchant. And they got the idea to build wine cellars inside the Manhattan anchor. And as crazy as it sounds, it really was a great place to store wine. The anchor to the bridge was cool, it was dark, it was a consistent temperature. It was really ideal for storing even really delicate older wines. So this was rented out as wine cellar storage space. They made pretty good money off of it, and it stayed a wine cellar all the way up until Prohibition started in the 1920s. So of course the wine cellar was closed down during Prohibition, but they did a brief grand reopening in 1934. They reopened the wine cellars, but in the 1940s they decided to close the cellars for good, and the anchorage here on the Manhattan side became municipal storage. Actually, during a routine inspection back in 2006, they discovered that at one point it seems like the Manhattan anchor was actually a Cold War era bunker. They found emergency rations and all sorts of different emergency preparedness items down there in the anchor. The date stamped on the boxes coincided with the year the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Manhattan anchor actually also stands on the spot where George Washington would have lived when he was the President of the United States here in New York City. As you're heading off of the Brooklyn Bridge, you start to get a really nice view of some of our wonderful buildings here in Lower Manhattan. This unique wavy-shaped building is an apartment building that was designed by Frank Gehry. The beautiful ornate building with the pointed green roof is the Woolworth Building. It was the tallest building in the world when it was first completed in 1913. The much smaller building with the little white dome straight behind me is our City Hall. And then this beautiful ornate building with the gold statue on the top is the Municipal Building, which is really an annex for our city government. So we have some lovely buildings here in Lower Manhattan that are absolutely worth checking out. next stop now is completely up to you. What do you feel like seeing next? And on that note, if you haven't already, please subscribe, like, and ring that bell so you can get notifications every time we release new content. Tips for your tour guide are absolutely not required, but they are so very appreciated. There are some links provided if you would like to do that. And thank you so much. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.